Hey everyone, welcome to the Safety Brief, a new podcast from Intelex where we'll talk about the hottest safety topics and offer perspectives on all things EHS. Hopefully you'll leave this pod with something to think about and maybe even something to apply. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my trusted co-host, Scott Gaddis, our VP of EHS Solutions at Intelex, as well as, for the first time in Safety Brief history, a guest on the pod. We have Rob Spatzer, mental health nurse practitioner, who's worked in the EHS space and is here to give a really great perspective and his experience on today's topic, the hidden hazard, mental health at work. We know about all the normal hazards the EHS practitioners are tasked with controlling, but one that's been emerging as a trend and one that's very hard to control, as not many people are necessarily well versed or familiar in how to control it, is mental health. So that will be today's subject. Really excited about this discussion. Let me toss it over to our star guest, Rob, to introduce himself.
Thanks, Trevor. I don't know about Star, but as Trevor said, I'm a mental health nurse practitioner. I'm also double boarded in acute care medicine. So I've treated patients in and out of the hospital. Both physical medicine and mental health, and really a lot of that stuff is very applicable to what we see in kind of the EHS space. And this is a huge topic. It's something that really is come to the forefront, and I think come to the sort of national attention more recently here in like the last couple of years. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. The pleasure is all ours. Scott, you've spent decades as someone working in EHS at the highest levels, and I'm certain this is a hazard that you've had to think about, and one that evolved probably during the tenure, your career as a practitioner. Talk to me about mental health as a hazard and how you've interacted with that, how you've seen it.
I mean, it's quite, and I'm glad Rob has joined us because this is certainly not a subject that I'm an expert in. I've seen the outputs, right, of mental health in the workplace, and so I'm stoked that we actually have a guest that can bring a little credibility to it. I'm stoked, absolutely stoked,
absolutely
that we can have this conversation. I think as I kind of look back, and I guess by far I'm the oldest. I've been doing this for 36 years. And you certainly, I was seeing signs all the way back, right, when I started of mental health and how it affected, for me, decision making in the workplace. And I don't know if I recognized it as burnout, but I did recognize it as an unhealthy behavior that I knew that I needed to intervene with, interface with, and try to figure it out. And when I started, I was a junior, specialist. I didn't have a lot of horsepower to make those type of decisions, but within 5 or 6 years, I was. And I'll tell you something that really resonated with me is when I joined Kimberly Clark in my first, site level leadership role, is that I worked for a facility manager that was acutely aware that mental health had an effect on the way that we worked. And it was very common for us to intervene. I still remember having conversations just simply about the ways people were feeling or some of the decisions that they were coming up with. I would even go out to the machine floor and talk about crises like children or financial pressures or relationship issues. And it made a big difference. So without a lot of training, I knew just simply having conversation, having interventions with people that were going through things. And I think a couple of things, Trevor, that really started to resonate with me is why I was not going through some of these same mental challenges, right, or emotional challenges that other people were, right? So that was kind of a clue for me, Rob, that people are just built different, right? They're just built different. Not all of us are the same in this particular, part of the discussion we're talking about.
Yeah, what was the guidance like? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say that I think that perspective that you bring, seeing that historical perspective and how things have sort of evolved over time is really valuable. And when, obviously I'm newer to the space than you, but one of the things I noticed when I got in was that there was sort of, we really thought from the safety side about physical safety, right? All of it, so many of the initiatives are around physical safety. How do we build a better thing to protect us from falling or getting hit and all those types of things, right? That's something you can really like sink your teeth into. I can build better webbing. I can build better attachment points. I can do all these different things. How do you address something that is unseen, that people not only is unseen and difficult to perceive, but that people intentionally don't want you to know about, right? How often do we know people walk around and they put this mask on? You don't really want to share the fact that you might be struggling with something, and all of us do. It's the human condition is that all of us are going to struggle with something at some point. How do you attack something like that when you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't grab a hold of it, right? And so I was sort of struck by how much focus has been, and it's understandable, right? We understand why you would focus on something that's tangible because it's sort of easy to lower hanging fruit. You can grab it. And these are very real, very, very dangerous things that people are dealing with, but it's this sort of unseen stuff that you don't typically see. And because it was very physical based and we didn't really know how to deal with this historically, what was the old adage? It was when you get to the workplace, you leave all your problems in your car when you shut the door. You leave that stuff in the parking lot, and when you cross the threshold, you're at work now, and this is what your focus is. From a mental health standpoint and just a human standpoint, that is completely unrealistic. And I think what we're seeing is we have to address that because it is so unrealistic to expect that people can just leave all their problems at home and they're going to be there waiting for them when they get back, right? We carry that stuff with us all the time.
You're basically describing Severance, the TV show, right? Where
I actually haven't seen it, but I keep meaning to watch it.
It's spoilers for anyone listening. Yeah, they show up, and as they go the elevator down into the office, their memory is flashed essentially, and they don't know anything about the outside life. So their problems are physically left at the door. But yeah, I mean, to that point, right? That's a TV show. It's not a documentary, and that's true. So it's like a hazard that you have to manage. Because to your point, Scott, I mean, it impacts what you do, the decisions you make. So many incidents are the result of I'm rushing, or I'm stressed, or I'm careless, or I'm not thinking about things, and those things have roots in people's emotional well-being and their mental well-being and what's going on and the stressors they're facing. It's interesting you said, Scott, that your boss was so, I guess, forward thinking about this. And when you went out to talk to these people and have these conversations, what was the guidance for you? Was it just, hey, Scott, go have a chat, go see what's going on with these people? Or was there something more material?
Yeah, Rob kind of hit on something because I came out of college, right, trained to take and mitigate physical hazards in the workplace, right? I had no training on how to deal with emotional, issues or mental issues. But I was seeing them as I said, the guidance was to intervene right in cases that seemed to indicate that we had an issue. So there wasn't a lot of guidance at the time, right? This was the 90s. But I also worked for a facility manager that did have his own right emotional, and he was very candid about it. So I think he had insight into what we were trying to mitigate right in the workforce. So the first thing was to go out and have conversation to try to get a pulse right for what I was seeing or what other leaders were seeing in the workplace. And I think what was bizarre at the time, it's not anymore, but our instructions were if somebody was not connected to the work that we were doing. And when I say that, right, we had people that were reaching into machinery, right? We had people that were lifting and tugging and pushing and threading machines. So his instruction was if they were not connected to the work, let's remove them from the work, right? Because we knew one thing, that they had to absolutely have 100% focus on what we were asking them to do. And I kind of look at that the way that I just read, I think I just watched it on NBC, like in 2022, I think there were like 6,000 construction workers that committed suicide, right?
Yeah,
And I just I was stunned by that. How could that be happening in constructions, and what were the reasons, or could there have been something that stopped that? Could there have been an intervention? So I think even without having that formal training, the intervention was for me to have that conversation with a frontline employee to really ask very candid questions. And the good thing is that I worked in a very mature organization where we did ask those mature questions, right? We really did want to come down to understanding what the issue was. And if that employee was open at all, it was just very common for us to say, listen, we know you're having a relationship issue. Go home, kind of work on that for the next 3 or 4 days. We're going to pay you, right? We're going to pay you while you're gone, while you can get that kind of settled. And even things like that, right, where they knew that they had an out, where they're not going to lose pay, during this time away, that they needed to go home and deal with things. It was a tremendous benefit. And Trevor, we talked about this. I had the safest site, at that time in Kimberly-Clark, and I think it was these type of things, right, that we were doing that were very innovative at the time, where we really did want this whole idea. And again, this guy that I work for, he had this idea of whole person health, right? And he knew there wasn't just physical things that we really had to address. It was this whole person. So we talked about things like physical, right, improvement. We talked about mental improvement. We talked about a lot of different things. So again, I didn't have a lot of training, but I knew how to talk, and I knew how to get down to a very granular, idea of what was going on in that person's, life. And I had the authority to send people home with pay, and we all did as leaders.
Yeah.
Even the team could do that very same thing. So it was a very mature organization. I know we're not all like that, but years later, right? I mean, this is not a diversion from this present topic, but the UK, right? The United Kingdom started, they started understanding that mental health was an important part of what they were seeing and risk there, right? And they, it's a radar, right? You basically record those type of events now, and that's still not happening in the U.S. But I kind of look at that and go, there's something there, right, that we really need to look at.
I mean, it's definitely a risk, but exactly, like it's been a minute since I've been in school for environment, health, and safety, and it's been a little bit since you were as a practitioner, Scott. But like, I know I didn't receive any explicit training necessarily on having these conversations or even on identifying these risks in a sense. Yet it's such a trend. I mean, Verdantix reports that about half of companies they reach out to in their annual survey are thinking about this and managing it in some way. But EHS folks are asked to do something maybe a bit outside of scope, even though it certainly falls into, it's a risk. Again, can cause negative outcomes, and that's the EHS person's job. Rob, from your perspective and your background and your training, I mean, how can people have these conversations, EHS people? How can we better prepare ourselves to play this role as well as the classic physical safety role?
Yeah. I think there's so much in what you guys have both just said that we can sort of unpack around that topic. I mean, it's interesting that you point out the UK. There's been a lot of research done in Australia as well around these topics. If people are familiar with the MATES program, MATES, so much really good work has come out of that. And these were mental health programs that were designed around the concept of providing peer support to within labor workforces. And what you were just describing, Scott, and going out and having these conversations, that is peer support, right? That's the model for it. And the fact that you were doing it way back then and that you had an organization that was supportive of it is really special, because there's a lot of organizations now that, even having breadth of understanding that we have today, really haven't embraced doing those things. And part of the reason I think they haven't embraced is what you're bringing up, Trevor, which is we're putting people in a position to do something that is uncomfortable and that they may not really be trained to do. And I think there's a major distinction that we should make here, which is between what peer support is and what that role really entails, and providing like formal mental health services, because that's not what we're asking people to do. We're seeing somebody like me in a clinical setting, or if I was brought into an organization or something like that, what you would typically see is that that's a very different power dynamic, right? You're bringing in, and it's sort of an expert patient dynamic. And those are sort of prescribed pathways in the way that we treat people and the way that we go through therapeutics and use different techniques. But that's really not for this my opinion, that for this population, that's probably less likely to be successful than having off the cuff peer conversations. This is not, we have to tailor what we're doing to our population, and our workforce populations are, as predominantly male, predominantly more stoic, people who really don't want to talk about these things. It's uncomfortable. And the only way, like, as we've said, these are invisible problems, right? So the only way you can get access to it is to start that conversation, is to have it. And so the question is sort of, how do you do that? And yeah, we can provide training and those types of things. But the biggest distinction when we do that training is to say to people, look, we're not asking, as an EHS professional, you are on the front lines. You are in a position to watch your workforce. You see what's going on. You get to know people's tendencies. You get to know how they work individually and within a group dynamic. And you're really the point of the tip of the spear who's going to identify this stuff, because you are proactively, if you're doing it right, you're proactively surveilling your population. You know that if a guy, he normally acts like this, something's off with this guy today. Yeah. It's just something, right? Yeah. It's your gestalt because you've seen him. Now, how do I start that conversation? And that's where the training part comes in, right? And I think people get more comfortable starting that conversation once they realize that we're not expecting them to be therapists. And because it's scary, right? It's really scary to try to have a therapeutic conversation with somebody when you might get into topics that you really feel ill-equipped to deal with. And so what we really try to focus on and tell people is, look, you are not trying to solve a problem here. What you are trying to do is be a conduit for that person to express what's going on. And we, I'll talk a lot about like our population, again, because it's male dominated, but obviously there's more women entering the workforce now as far as labor workforces. But at least as it applies to men, we're really good at internalizing things. And we don't want that stuff to get out, right? That's why we put that mask on. It's why a person who looks happy, sad, miserable, depressed can look exactly the same, right? And we don't know. And so the only way we know is to like put out those little feelers, have those conversations, sort of embed ourselves in the workforce to try to figure out something's not right with this. And then we act as the conduit for that person to share at the level they're comfortable with. That process, from a mental health standpoint, that process of going from an internalization to an externalization of a problem, it can be a little bit traumatic for a person who's not used to sharing those types of things, but it is the way forward for these people. It's the way forward for them to be able to start to feel more comfortable. And quite frankly, we spend a whole lot of time at work, right? So the idea that we're going to shut these things off at work, spend 8-10 hours there, then turn them back on, it just isn't realistic. If we do this right, and we can get people to be comfortable in these roles where they're sort of interacting with people, your mental health can improve at work, right? Instead of it being this burden that I carry with me. But again, it's really important. And I think that's a really crucial piece, because our EHS people themselves, hearing these stories, hearing this stuff, some of that can be traumatic, and they take that burden on themselves. So how do we sort of prepare people to do that? And it really is emphasizing the point that you are having peer-to-peer conversations. I love the point that you made, Scott, which was, you were having conversations with people who were experiencing things that you hadn't experienced. However, I bet you've experienced something similar, right? It may not have been the exact same thing. Maybe in me, a situation produces anger, but in somebody else, it produces anxiety. In somebody else, it produces depressive symptoms. But we've all experienced something that's triggered that. So that's the sharing part of this, is we actually, at the peer level, we can really say to each other, I may not know exactly how you feel, but I've had an experience and this is how it made me feel. And this is what I did about it. And you sort of get into this cadence where people get more comfortable sharing things. It becomes less stigmatizing to share those things. And it becomes this environment where people now really rely on each other and trust each other. Not only are you helping the mental health standpoint, your productivity goes through the roof. Teams become cohesive, right? You have all of these ancillary benefits from an employment standpoint, as well as the fact that you're really helping people.
Yeah, I think, Robin, I think this, right? Safety performance has always started before safety, right? And to explain that is that I could literally pin my relationship building to building trust, right? To building the integrity and the ethics of the organization, to how well I was going to perform in safety, right? So if I wanted great safety performance, I had to build relationships. I had to build trust in the workforce. I literally had to build these partnerships within my organizations. And once I was on that path, they would talk to me, right? So they trusted me. They knew that I was someone. And again, I mean, I've worked for some great people, but I had the president that I worked for, actually at Kimberly-Clark, and said, I want you to treat everyone as your immediate family members, right? What would you say to them? Well, you would have conversation, right? You would really inquire about what was going on. And once you're able to do that, I think you're exactly right, Rob, is that performance gets better, quality gets better, right? Maintenance is just better because we're interconnected, right? Or what I kind of call interdependent on each other, where we're collaborating. And once you can kind of get that, I think, Trevor, that's kind of the magic potion, right, of leading safety, is these type of collaborative connections where you trust one another, where you really kind of are in this together, where you kind of lose the title, right? And you just become another person there. that may be doing a different job, but you're more equal. And I think sometimes, we kind of brushed on that about, why do we see this so much in construction? I'm not sure it's only construction, right? But we have data that suggests, right, that it's a rampant problem in construction. Is it because they're more stoic? Is it because they may be subcontractors and they don't have these relationships with a GC or something, right? So there's probably a lot of different things going on. I guess I was fortunate because I always had these organizations where I had them within the walls, right, where I could actually build those relationships. So that's kind of another path to go down is, well, how do you quickly establish relationships in a way that you can make, positive change?
On construction, I feel like I've heard a potential relationship between the suicide problem, kinds of like the kinds of workers that work in construction, more transient type workers, maybe ones that don't have a steady job or are away from home more on a big project, right? There's like a whole new set of hazards or a change in the likelihood of maybe personal issues depending on what the nature of the work versus a factory worker that works at the same factory that's 15 minutes away. It's coming in every day, a lot more stability leading to potentially just I don't know what the right word is here, but less likelihood of mental health impacting issues. And on managing well-being in the workplace as an EHS professional. So you're having those conversations with people that relating to them without necessarily having worn their shoes or walked a mile in their shoes. And it's funny because Scott, you and I have been trotted out to talk about safety culture, infinity times, countless times in conferences, webinars like this. And while there are so many things that technology can do to help you manage culture, and while there are so many policies you can put in place and best practices, to an extent, it all just comes back to talking and embedding the culture the good old fashioned way, right? Like internalizing a set of beliefs and values just by being accessible and having everyone feel like so-and-so is looking out for me and I'm looking out for them. And we do things safely because that's kind of what we do here and we care about each other in a way. Maybe that sounds too kumbaya around the campfire, but hey, that is safety culture at the end of the day, no?
I think it is, Rob, and I'll ask you to kind of come in on this, right, is that I'm at the top of this funnel, right, when I intervene and interface with this person, but I do need to get them to someone that can set up steps or a path, right, to get to a positive conclusion. How do you look at that, right? What is that? Once, I kind of equate it to how we used to tell people, well, there's an EAP, call them, right? I think it's more than that. I think we have to be more purposeful at the beginning, right, to get them to the right person.
100% agree. And I think that it really mirrors like how we actually think about human beings, right? And so again, as we've sort of talked about, like EHS professionals kind of at the tip of the spear. You're the one who's going to identify. But if our strategy is, okay, our company's got an EAP or some other resource like that, and our entire strategy is based on, okay, we identify this person and now we basically push point them towards the EAP, and the EAP sort of takes it from there. Again, we have to look at our population and see, is this realistic? Are we doing this because we don't know how to help them, or are we doing it because we think that is the correct solution? Now, an EAP, as far as I'm concerned, is a part of the solution. But for many populations, it can't be the entire solution, because again, if you think about heavy labor workforces, right? But we could make different parallels to different industries. But if we think about labor workforces, we've already talked about this is a population of people for whom sharing is not comfortable. And even outside of that, therapy, which is what EAP essentially plugs you into some sort of mental health professional, right? Somebody like me or a psychiatrist or a therapist, social worker, those types of things. And they're going to put you, they're going to do some sort of evaluation, a triage type process, and then they're going to set up some sort of therapeutic session management, something like that. Now, I think we can all, if the three of us sat here and thought about 10 people that we've worked with, how many of those people would willingly jump into that process and say, oh, I'm on board. Let me go and sit through these 5 or 6 therapy sessions, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to share everything. And it's just not very realistic, right? And I say that as somebody who has done these things clinically. One of the points that I make when I'm talking to people is that I talk out of sort of both sides of my mouth, right? I talk through the lens of a mental health professional, but I also talk out of the lens of just a guy and or some guy who has an opinion about something. And what I have found is that when I've had authentic conversations with people just on a peer-to-peer level, I find those conversations in some cases are more therapeutic than the formal therapy sessions I've had. And again, we have to look at our populations and see what's most appropriate. But the key to me is authenticity. When I'm talking to people as a therapist or in a therapeutic setting, a clinical setting, there are certain things I will not say and I cannot say because in my training, I'm not going to do that. So for example, if I was having a therapeutic session with somebody, it's all about that person, right? I'm going to encourage you to share. I'm going to encourage you to talk. I'm going to ask questions back at you to try to get you to continue to explore what it is you're talking about. What I'm not going to do is tell you that I personally, Rob, has had a similar situation. I'm not going to tell you that, I suffer from depression also, or that I have periods of anxiety also. Why? Because in a therapeutic setting, it's not supposed to be about me. It's supposed to be about you and your exploration. And it would be, professionally inappropriate for me to interject myself and my personal stuff into that. Not that we don't ever share anything, but not at the level that we're talking about. Now, so how do you get a person who's used to not talking about anything and all of a sudden you stick them in an EAP and is very linear, right? It goes in one direction only. I think the way you really want to do that is you start at the peer level and you have authentic conversations with people. You get them in the habit of sharing because you're sharing, right? Self-disclosure encourages self-disclosure. So when I start talking about myself, it becomes less about, in a peer setting, it becomes less about me trying to tell you what the right thing is and more about us sharing an experience, which is, man, life is tough sometimes and we got to deal with whatever it is. So now what have I done through that? It seems simple, right? And in some ways it is, but I've had an authentic conversation with somebody where I've shared something about themselves, they've shared it, and now each of us feel less alone than we did when we started that conversation. Now, over time, what happens? It just becomes natural for you to have that conversation, and then you're going to start it with somebody else, and you're going to start it with somebody else, and so you sort of build these networks of support. Now, and we got to remember, right, that mental health exists on the spectrum. So we're not talking necessarily, we could be talking about people who have formal mental health diagnoses, or we could be just talking about any one of us on any given day who's having a bad day, who's having anxiety, who's having whatever. The key is peer support and authentic conversations, and that network of support that we're building helps people on the day-to-day basis. When and if somebody has toggled over now on that spectrum, again, it's a continuous spectrum of mental health. When they've toggled over into something that's more serious, now because we've established this authenticity, this rapport, and we've made them more comfortable, now when I direct them towards the EAP, they're going to have way more success. They're going to interact. They're going to participate in the more formal therapeutic stuff way more easily than they would have before, because now they're used to having that conversation. And importantly, when we I use the word turf, but it's not really, when we direct people to an EAP, that doesn't mean that we as EHS professionals stop. It doesn't mean our job is done. Right. It means we're going to continue that peer relationship. We're going to continue checking in with that person. We're going to continue to do all the things that we were doing at our level. Why? Not because it solves the whole problem, but because, to your point, it treats them like a member of the family. You're checking in on them, you're doing that stuff, and it's going to make the formal things that we've now established far more successful.
Trevor, one of the things I heard Rob say, and I think this is maybe the number one lesson for EHS professionals that are listening, or leaders that are listening, right? And I wrote it down, right? Be brave enough to share about yourself, right? Be transparent. But I think, Rob, you said it best, is be authentic, because I think 99% of every problem that somebody else is going through, we've gone through it, right? We've gone through those problems. They're pretty common, right? So being authentic enough to say, I have been there. I'm not there today, but I've been there, right? And we can talk about that. What do you think about that, Trevor? Does that work with someone as young as you are? Is that something you would expect, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny listening to all of this. There's so many programs and tools in place, but it keeps coming back down to Rob. What you said has been so kind of eloquent and concise in a way that it's just about having a conversation, like get people comfortable talking, not having therapy, not reaching out to the EAP, not some structured check-in that is explicitly about mental well-being and psychological safety per se, but just conversations and openness, and give people the forum with which to talk about whatever they need to talk about, but make sure that opportunity is there. It's going to be tricky because, like we said in early, you have some young EHS person just out of school that goes to site and goes to some 55-year-old construction worker. It's been there forever. And now maybe you have a great forward-thinking EHS boss, just like you did, Scott, and you're supposed to go out there and have the conversations, but this guy's not interested in talking. Like, he's just not interested. And you want to continue to kind of crack that nut. But as you said, stoic, stand off, like, nope, we're not having this conversation. I'm going to get back to work.
What we have to remember is that, again, very different from when I see somebody in a therapeutic setting, they're coming into my office and I'm seeing them today. Maybe I see them once next week, so I see them a couple of times a week. These are snapshots in time. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in between those things. Right. And so we have to remember, from an EHS standpoint, EHS professionals, that you don't have to crack this nut in a day. With most people, you're not going to be able to, because it's not about, you are not a therapist. I'm not asking you to try to make somebody better. I'm not asking you to fix their problem. Well, all we're trying to do is create an environment where, over time, some people are going to want to share right away. Some people are great sharers and they love talking about stuff and it's wonderful. And other people don't want to talk about anything ever. Over time, that time is our ally in this situation, right? We want to establish that, but to the point you made many times, Scott, was you've got to establish that trust. Take the title out of it for a second and just be somebody they can talk to. I think one of the crucial pieces of trying to attack this is you have to get buy-in from leadership, and you have to get buy-in from the top. Without that, it just is not effective, because I think we all know that some people view EHS professionals as the corporate police to make sure you're doing everything safely. And I'm going to come over and cite you if you don't do this or that or the other thing. That hat, to tackle this problem, we've got to take that hat off, or at least turn it to the side or something, because we have to be able to talk to people as if they're human beings. To your point, Trevor, we have technologies. We can develop technologies around this, but those technologies can't take the place of this. They have to support our efforts, but they can't really replace them.
Absolutely. The concept is so darn simple in a sense, yet hard to execute, but it makes all the sense in the world. We're running out of time before we have to rename from the safety brief to something else, but I want to touch on one topic before we end. Also, we've talked a lot about the hidden hazard, right? Mental health at work, and how to approach that, and how to maybe make people more accessible. But that's very much the EHS person still focusing ultimately on their job, which is identify hazard, de-risk hazard, and proceed from there in a continuous cycle of identifying and mitigating risk. But what about the mental health of the EHS professional themselves, right? EHS professionals are in an interesting spot. You mentioned a second ago, Rob, the corporate police. You, on one hand, have this kind of responsibility of just the actual safety of people. When Scott, I'm sure you can attest to this, when you're the safety leader and someone gets hurt, it's not just whatever worker messing up an email, or the quality of a widget, or like, there's real consequences that go so far outside of work. There's things on the line, and you're trying to protect people like that. And I mean, I'm trained in EHS, like, we talk to EHS people all the time. I feel like a lot of them do have this bigger sense of purpose about the role in a lot of cases. So you're tasked with that. You need to carry the burden of when things do go wrong. You need to be a person that's going out and having conversations. You're a technical person. You're a personable person. There's so much that goes into the life of an EHS professional in a lot of areas where mental health issues could creep in. Like, there's opportunity. Scott, how did you deal with that? Or have you dealt with that?
It's a great thing, because it's a great question. I've worked with professionals that have, quote, felt the burnout, right, of doing the roles most of the times. And some of them have worked for me or have been associated with me. They have left themselves in the center, right, of the organization to be the decision desk. So they're the most technical. They're the one that you must come to, right, for the magic answer to your problem. So they have put themselves in the center of this organization where everybody comes to. And at the end of the day, they've got a priority list of 15 items that they didn't get done, because they just didn't have time. So they work longer, right? Or they work the weekends, or they think about it when they're away from work. I won't say that I ever disengaged from work. There are nights that I lost sleep because I was worried about something, but normally that wasn't the way that I wanted to work. I've never had a too big of a team to do all of the work that I needed to do. So I found the more that I could spread my work, right? So maybe at the beginning, I always kind of start in the center to build technicality, right, or technical expertise within the organization. And then I look for a way to get partnerships established in the organization so people could take my work away from me, right? And it's not the fact that I was lazy, it's the fact that if I could connect them to some of the work that I was responsible for doing, it did a couple of things, right? It meant that they were going to participate with me and they were going to partner with me to lead safety and health or environmental work out further in the organization, right? So it meant they had skin in the game. And when they had skin in the game, they were willing to take a micro part or a mini part of my role away from me and do it. So that allowed me to kind of draw down my priority list and be there, right, for the most important parts of my role. And then I kind of went outside of that group, right? So when I started in corporate work or trying to share outside of the plant that I was in, I had to have those people, right? So I wasn't there on a daily basis. So I went outside of that work, and then they were only using me for really, really important things. So it's a long way to say is that if you can build competence in the organization, if you can build capacity in the organization so they give back to it, you'll be in an organization that supports you as an EHS professional. I think it gets a little harder, and it may be some of the reason that we see some of this in verticals like construction, right, where you may have new people or transient people, Trevor, as you said, where you're seeing new people, the turnover is great, right? So you may have to do things differently, but even there, you could take a small, central team and you can work on their competence in different ways to take parts of that away from you. I would say this is I've never thought that I was the most competent, the most technical in the EHS space. I've never thought that way. What I wanted to do is have balance, right? I wanted to be able to have balance across everything that I was responsible to do. And a big part of that was building capability to do my job in the workforce and to give them the capacity to do it. And the other thing was working on behaviors. What should we see? And that's not only looking for observations and getting feedback, that was having engagement, right? That was just having conversations with the workforce, because I did find the more they knew you, the better they performed, right? The better they were willing to just talk about things. So I think there's some ways that we kind of put ourselves in a box as professionals saying, I am the policeman of the county, right? Come to me for any problem that you have. And once you do that, you do pile on a lot of work that you just really simply cannot get done, or I would not have been able to do it. So my magic, always spread it out, if you possibly can.
Makes sense. What about you, Rob? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, when we think about EHS professionals, and particularly as this, like to your point, you sort of become the go-to person for a vast number of things, right? Some of which you're prepared to deal with and some of which you aren't. But because you're there and you're present and you're embedded in the workforce, whatever that workforce looks like, it just de facto, you become that person. And so I think as organizations, we have to think about, as that role expands, right, beyond just physical safety, beyond all the other stuff they're going to dump on your plate. Now we're talking about, okay, well, how do we support people's mental health and those things as well, right? So is that burden could even potentially grow, and in a way that people might not be super comfortable with at first. So I think as organizations, we really have to think about how are we supporting our EHS people in that process, right? We often think about things like debriefings after traumatic events. You've got some big bad thing that happens, and we bring people together and we talk about it. Critically important. It's part of critical incident stress debriefing, and it's a process that we use. Could we also use a process, just a check-in debriefing once in a while with our EHS people to see how you're doing, right? Not everything we tend to put so many big processes in place for big events. But big events, while they are very scary and they're sort of signature events, they don't happen that often. And so on a day, we have to think about what's going on a daily basis. How is this person just getting through this week, getting through this day, whatever it is? So should we think about things like more informal, short, small group debriefings, those types of things, just to get together? If we're going to encourage our workforce to do this stuff, maybe we get all our EHS people together and they start sharing things. They set up their own peer groups, right? I've seen in certain labor forces where a couple of people decided to start a group, and they would get together like on a pick a day, Wednesday at after work, they would hang out for 15 minutes and talk. And at first it was a couple of people, informal, just getting together, talking, whatever. People started joining, they started coming in. And then in toolbox talks, to use the construction example, in toolbox talks, they would mention, hey, we do this thing. If anyone wants to join, it's fine, whatever. But stuff like that is also sort of for your EHS people to talk, because now you establish peer groups where these people really can relate with each other. Oh yeah, I dealt with that last year, right? And that was really tough, and it was tough on me. This is how I got through it. So those types of things where we typically think about them after a very traumatic event when they're critically important can also be utilized at a much smaller scale, just to sort of have check-ins, get people, just help people manage the day-to-day stuff. Because when we're talking about stress, burnout, these are all very real things for EHS people. If your EHS people are experiencing too much stress, too much burnout, can they really do what they're supposed to be doing? Can they really support the workforce in the way that we want them to? So we have to support those people, right? It's in healthcare, we call this similar concept caregiver fatigue, right? And it's people who it's a concept where you'll often see it in people who have like a family member who has a chronic illness, and they're taking care of them every single day. They love that person. They want to help them. They want to do everything, but that burden becomes very, very real. And it's called caregiver fatigue. We have very similar concepts in the EHS, right? You're responsible. You internalize these things. You see the pain people are going through. Now I'm asking you to talk about it. We've got to take care of these people or they can't do their job effectively.
It makes all the sense in the world. And I just don't think people think about it like that. It's always the employee base and not the me in a weird way. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Well, I would just say, I think Rob is right, is that when I kind of look back in my career, I was sometime HR, I was sometime maintenance person, I was the quality. I've never been in a vocation where EHS touches everyone else more deeply than almost any other activity, right, in a organization. Your chaplain, right? So we just touch so many people differently. I can see, right, where professionals can be fatigued themselves, right, and kind of suffer through this burnout. But I think Rob's exactly right, is that there are things, and many times we got to learn to say no in a very eloquent way, right? We just got to say, I can't do that too. And that is a big problem for us, because I think we are like healthcare professionals, is that it's very difficult for us to say no, because we're very passionate about what we do, and that's what makes us great, is passionate about our roles. So, yeah.
We are great, aren't we? Let's end on that. All right, no, but it is time to wrap up. Rob, you have been incredibly valuable to this. I really appreciate your time today talking. This has been insightful, I hope, for our listeners, but also insightful for me personally as a professional in this space, and I'm sure you as well, Scott. So just thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime as we continue to blow up and climb up the charts here.
Thank you guys for having me. It was a great conversation.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rob.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it, everyone's attention, and we'll catch you next time on the Safety Brief. Thank you.